On January 4th, 46 BCE, the most brilliant military commander in history stood on African sand, watching 16,000 enemy warriors surround his 1,000 men. Julius Caesar had come to Africa to hunt down the last remnants of Pompey's faction, but now he faced annihilation in the barren hills outside Ruspina. Picture this: 1,000 Roman soldiers, their red cloaks vivid against yellow sand, completely encircled by Numidian cavalry whose war cries echoed off the rocky outcrops like thunder from an approaching storm. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. 16 enemies for every Roman, no reinforcements within 50 miles, no escape route through the swirling mass of horsemen who moved like desert wind, appearing and vanishing behind clouds of dust that turned the afternoon sun into a blood-red disk. Caesar's political situation was more desperate than most people realize. The civil war that had torn Rome apart for years was supposed to end with Pompey's death in Egypt. But Cato the Younger and Scipio had rebuilt republican resistance in North Africa. They commanded 60,000 men, including King Juba's legendary Numidian cavalry, warriors who had been born in the saddle and could put 3 arrows in the air before a Roman could draw his gladius. Back in Rome, Caesar's enemies waited like vultures. One major defeat, one broken legion, and they would strip him of everything. This wasn't just another campaign. It was Caesar's final gamble for absolute power. The morning had started as routine as any other foraging expedition. Caesar needed supplies for his 6 underman legions camped near the coast. African grain was scarce, water even scarcer, and his men had been eating half rations for weeks. The local terrain favored his enemies completely. Unlike Gaul's forests and rivers, Africa offered endless open plains where cavalry could maneuver freely, while Roman heavy infantry suffocated in formations designed for European warfare. The temperature that January day climbed past 90 degrees by mid morning, and Roman armor became an oven that cooked men inside their own bronze and leather. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Caesar's tactical blindness that morning. His Germanic cavalry, the same horsemen who had won Himalaya, were completely useless in African conditions. Their heavy mounts couldn't match Numidian speed. Their weapons were wrong for desert warfare, and they had never faced enemies who could shoot backwards while retreating at full gallop. Caesar's intelligence about enemy numbers was catastrophically wrong. His scouts reported a few hundred Numidian raiders. The reality was King Juba's finest cavalry, 16,000 strong, commanded by Labienus, Caesar's former lieutenant, who knew every Roman tactical formation because he had helped perfect them. The trap had been months in preparation. Cardinal Scipio understood Caesar's weakness. He needed victories, needed them fast, needed them spectacularly. A careful, patient enemy could exploit his aggression by offering what appeared to be easy targets. The foraging mission was perfect bait. Caesar couldn't resist leading it personally, bringing just enough men to seem formidable, but not enough to survive what was coming. The enemy had studied Roman logistics, Roman movement patterns, Roman psychology. They knew Caesar would take risks others wouldn't dare. As the dust clouds first appeared on the horizon, Caesar's centurions should have ordered immediate retreat to the coast. Standard doctrine demanded withdrawal when facing superior cavalry numbers in open terrain. But Caesar had spent 6 years in Gaul, proving that standard doctrine was for ordinary commanders. And the greatest military genius in history was about to discover that African warfare followed completely different rules. The Numidians moved like water flowing around stone, surrounding the Roman column without seeming to attack, just watching, waiting, letting fear do their work for them. What happened next would test whether Roman discipline could overcome mathematical impossibility, whether tactical genius could defeat 16-to-1 odds, and whether Caesar's legendary fortune would hold in the burning wasteland where empires came to die. The Numidian cavalry struck like a desert sandstorm, appearing everywhere at once, yet never quite close enough for Roman steel to reach. By the second hour of what Caesar had planned as a simple foraging expedition, his 1,000 men found themselves trapped in a nightmare of mobility and precision that European warfare had never prepared them for. The enemy horsemen rode in perfect circles around the Roman formation, staying just beyond javelin range, loosing arrows in coordinated volleys that fell like deadly rain on shields raised against the merciless African sun. Each circuit brought fresh riders while exhausted horses were rotated to the rear, creating an endless cycle of harassment that Roman heavy infantry had no answer for. Labienus commanded the Numidian swarm with intimate knowledge of Roman weaknesses. Caesar's former lieutenant had spent years learning how legions moved, how they thought, how they reacted under pressure. Now he used that knowledge like a surgeon's knife, probing for soft spots in formations he had once helped design. The Numidians feinted charges that forced Romans into defensive squares, then wheeled away at the last second, leaving Caesar's men gasping in bronze armor that trapped heat like furnaces. Every false attack drained energy the Romans couldn't spare. Every retreat mocked their inability to close with enemies who fought like ghosts made of dust and arrows. The killing began in earnest as the sun reached its peak. Numidian javelins found gaps between shields with surgical precision. Men who had survived Gaul's forests and Germanic charges fell to weapons they couldn't even see coming, launched from horseback by warriors who could hit a target at full gallop from 50 yards. He wounded couldn't be evacuated because there was nowhere to go. They lay in the center of the formation, their groans adding psychological pressure to physical exhaustion. Roman discipline held, but Caesar could see doubt creeping into veteran faces as arrows continued to fall, and no Roman weapon could reach back. Then everything changed when the Numidians revealed the true scope of their trap. What Caesar had taken for random harassment was actually hearing. The enemy cavalry had been driving his formation steadily southeast, away from the coast, away from any hope of retreat to his base camp. The Romans found themselves in a natural amphitheater of low hills where cavalry could attack from elevation, while infantry struggled uphill through loose sand that grabbed at their sandals like quicksand. Here's what military historians miss about this moment. Caesar realized he had been outgeneraled by his own former student. Labienus wasn't just commanding Numidians. He was conducting a symphony of destruction that used Roman predictability against Roman strength. The psychological warfare proved as devastating as the physical attacks. Numidian war cries echoed off the hills in languages Romans didn't understand, creating an alien soundtrack of approaching doom. The enemy horsemen displayed captured Roman standards from earlier defeats, taunting Caesar's men with proof that other legions had already fallen to African tactics. Some Numidians rode close enough to shout Latin insults, learned from deserters, calling the Romans cowards who hid behind shields because they feared honest combat. Every taunt was calculated to provoke Romans into breaking formation, into charging after enemies who would simply melt away and return with arrows. By the fourth hour, Caesar faced a crisis that threatened to destroy more than just his army. His Germanic cavalry, the horsemen who had won him Gaul, proved utterly inadequate against Numidian mobility. Their heavy mounts and European tactics were like siege engines in a foot race. When they charged, the Numidians scattered like startled birds, only to reform and attack the now isolated Germans from behind. 3 separate cavalry actions ended with Caesar's horsemen streaming back to the protection of the infantry squares. Their mounts layered and exhausted, while the enemy seemed as fresh as morning. The mathematics of attrition were becoming impossible to ignore. Roman arrows were finite, water was running low, and the African sun was turning armor into instruments of torture. Meanwhile, the Numidians seemed to multiply rather than diminish. Fresh squadrons appearing on distant ridges like mirages that resolved into deadly reality. Caesar counted enemy banners from a dozen different tribes, all united under Juba's authority and Labienus's tactical genius. What he faced wasn't just cavalry. It was a confederation of the finest light horsemen in the ancient world, warriors whose ancestors had been fighting mounted warfare's sigh. NCE before Rome was founded. Then Caesar did something no Roman general had ever attempted in open battle against cavalry. Caesar's revolutionary decision emerged from pure desperation transformed into tactical genius. Instead of maintaining the traditional Roman square formation that made his men sitting targets for Numidian arrows, he ordered something never before attempted against cavalry in open terrain. His 1,000 legionaries would form a single extended line, 4 men deep, stretching nearly half a mile across the valley floor. To every centurion who heard the command, it sounded like suicide. Extended lines were for fighting infantry, not mobile horsemen who could concentrate their entire force against any weak point. But Caesar had seen something in the Numidian attack patterns that even Labienus had missed. The transformation took 20 minutes of agonizing vulnerability. Roman sentries wheeled and extended, while arrows continued to fall, men dropping as they struggled to maintain formation during the most dangerous maneuver in ancient warfare. The Numidians pressed their advantage, sensing Roman confusion, sending wave after wave of horsemen against what appeared to be a formation in complete disarray. Caesar moved along the line personally, his purple cloak making him a target for every enemy archer, but his presence kept exhausted legionaries from breaking as they extended into what looked like a human sacrifice to Numidian mobility. Here's where legend meets tact. Equal reality. Caesar wasn't just gambling on courage against mathematics. He had identified the fatal flaw in Numidian tactics that not even Labienus understood. The enemy cavalry's greatest strength, their ability to concentrate overwhelming force against any point, required them to mass together for maximum impact. But massing horsemen created vulnerability in terrain where maneuver space was limited. Caesar's extended line would force the Numidians to choose between attacking in small groups, negating their numerical advantage, or concentrating in areas where the surrounding hills would restrict their escape routes. The first test came when 2,000 Numidian horsemen charged the Roman center, expecting to shatter the thin line like pottery against stone. Instead, they found themselves funneled between rocky outcrops into a killing zone where Roman javelins could reach them, and their own mobility became a liability. The legionaries didn't try to hold ground in the traditional sense. They gave way in calculated retreats that drew the horsemen deeper into terrain that favored heavy infantry. When the Numidians wheeled to escape, they found themselves trapped between converging Roman wings that had closed like the jaws of a trap. The slaughter in that narrow valley bottom lasted less than 10 minutes, but changed everything. Numidian horses, bred for speed on open plains, stumbled on loose rocks and thorny scrub. Riders who had terrorized Romans all morning suddenly found themselves within gladius range of veterans who had been waiting hours for this moment. The sound of iron on bone echoed off the hillsides as Roman discipline met Numidian desperation in close combat that favored neither speed nor arrows, but pure savagery. 300 enemy horsemen died in that valley, their bodies marking the first Roman success of a day that had seemed destined for disaster. But Caesar's tactical masterstroke went beyond that single engagement. The extended line created multiple simultaneous combats across the valley, preventing Labienus from coordinating his forces effectively. Instead of one overwhelming attack, the Numidians found themselves fighting dozens of smaller actions where their mobility advantage disappeared and Roman training became decisive. Century by century, sword stroke by sword stroke, the legionaries proved that close combat remained their domain regardless of how many arrows had fallen on their shields. The psychological impact rippled through both armies faster than battlefield messengers could carry news. Roman cheers rose from the valley floor as men who had been preparing to die suddenly saw victory within reach. Conversely, Numidian war cries faltered as warriors who had never faced effective resistance from Roman infantry watched their comrades fall in terrain that should have favored cavalry. The mathematical certainty of 16-to-1 odds began wavering as tactical innovation met cultural arrogance in combat that neither side had anticipated. Labanus watched his perfect trap transform into Caesar's killing ground and understood that his former commander had once again rewritten the rules of warfare. The Numidian advantage required open terrain and freedom to maneuver. Caesar had used the landscape itself to neutralize both, turning African geography against African tactics with a precision that only years of European campaigning could have taught him. What happened in the next 30 minutes would determine whether tactical genius could overcome numerical impossibility, whether Roman innovation could defeat Numidian tradition, and whether Caesar's legendary fortune extended to African sand. The decisive moment arrived when Caesar recognized that Labanus had committed his reserve cavalry to reinforce the failed valley attack. In 17 minutes of calculated audacity, Caesar would either vindicate his tactical revolution or watch his last army die on African sand. The Roman line had held through 3 separate Numidian charges, but Caesar could see exhaustion etching lines on veteran faces beneath bronze helmets that had become furnaces in the desert heat. Sweat mixed with blood on gladius hilts made weapons slippery. The wounded lay in growing numbers behind the extended formation, their groans a constant reminder that Roman endurance had limits. Even tactical genius couldn't extend indefinitely. Then Caesar spotted the opening that would define his legend. Labanus had pulled warriors from his left wing to support the valley engage, creating a gap in the Numidian encirclement nearly 300 yards wide. It was a fleeting opportunity, visible only to a commander who understood both Roman capabilities and enemy psychology. Caesar had perhaps 5 minutes before Numidian mobility closed the gap. 5 minutes to achieve what no Roman army had managed against superior cavalry in open African terrain. He would not just break the encirclement, he would shatter it so completely that psychological shock would multiply tactical success into strategic victory. The charge began with Caesar's personal intervention that became military legend. Taking 2 centuries of his finest veterans, men who had followed him from Gaul through civil war to African exile, he led them personally toward the gap in enemy lines. His purple cloak streamed behind him as he ran, making him visible to every Roman and Numidian on the battlefield. The sight of their commander charging on foot transformed exhausted legionaries into an unstoppable human battering ram. Centuries that had been barely holding defensive positions suddenly found strength for offensive action that defied both mathematics and military logic. The impact when Romans met Numidians in the gap created a sound that witnesses described as thunder wrapped in screaming. Horses reared and fell as gladi found their bellies. Riders who had terrorized infantry all morning suddenly faced disciplined steel in terrain where speed meant nothing and training everything. The collision lasted perhaps 3 minutes, but those minutes decided the battle. Roman heavy infantry designed for close combat proved devastating against cavalry caught without room to maneuver. Every sword stroke was calculated, every shield push coordinated, every step forward bought with Numidian blood that darkened the sand beneath their feet. Here's what happened next that military historians still debate. The breakthrough created a cascade effect that no tactical manual had ever described. As Caesar's assault force punched through enemy lines, the extended Roman formation suddenly contracted like a closing fist. Instead of maintaining their defensive stance, the legionaries began advancing simultaneously across the entire valley. What had been a desperate defensive action transformed into a coordinated offensive that caught 16,000 Numidians completely unprepared for Roman aggression in terrain they had controlled all day. Labanus watched his tactical masterpiece disintegrate in real time as Roman discipline met Numidian confusion in dozens of separate combats. His horsemen trained for mobility warfare found themselves fighting at close quarters where their advantages disappeared and Roman weapons dominated. The psychological shock rippled through tribal contingents that had never faced effective infantry resistance. Warriors who had been pressing attack all morning suddenly found themselves defending against an enemy they had written off as defeated. The role reversal happened so quickly that any Numidians didn't understand what was occurring until Roman steel was already among them. The slaughter began in earnest when Numidian morale cracked under pressure no desert warrior had anticipated. Entire squadrons that had been circling Roman positions like wolves around wounded prey suddenly broke and fled toward distant hills, abandoning wounded comrades in tactical positions that had taken hours to establish. The sound of retreat, horses galloping away from battle, created a psychological avalanche that spread faster than any battlefield messenger. Within minutes, organized Numidian resistance collapsed into individual survival. As 16,000 warriors decided that discretion trumped valor when facing Romans who refused to die quietly, Caesar seized the moment with predatory instincts that separated genius from competence. Instead of celebrating survival, he ordered immediate pursuit. Roman centuries that had been fighting desperately for their lives suddenly found themselves hunting enemies who had terrorized them all morning. The reversal was so complete, so sudden, that many legionaries later claimed they couldn't believe what their own eyes were showing them. They had gone from mathematical impossibility to tactical dominance in less time than it took the African sun to move 1 degree across the merciless sky. But the true magnitude of Caesar's victory would only become clear when the killing finally stopped, and the accountants began counting bodies scattered across sand that had been yellow at dawn and was red by afternoon. The pursuit lasted until the African sun touched the western horizon, transforming Caesar's defensive victory into a slaughter that would echo through military history. Roman centuries, energized by their impossible survival, chased fleeing Numidians across 12 miles of desert terrain that had favored cavalry all morning, but now became a trap for warriors. Too panicked to use their mobility effectively, the mathematical reversal was staggering. By sunset, Caesar's 1,000 men had killed nearly 4,000 Numidian horsemen, while losing fewer than 200 of their own. Bodies littered the valley floor and surrounding hills like dark stones scattered across yellow sand, marking the path of a rout so complete that witnesses struggled to believe what they had witnessed. The immediate aftermath revealed the true scope of Caesar's tactical revolution. Labienus himself barely escaped capture, abandoning his command position when it became clear that organized resistance had collapsed into individual flight. His carefully coordinated battle plan, months in preparation, had disintegrated in less than an hour once Roman discipline met Numidian shock in terrain that neutralized cavalry advantages. Among the enemy dead lay chieftains from 6 different tribes, their ornate weapons and armor testament to the political coalition that Caesar had shattered along with their military formation. King Juba's finest cavalry, warriors who had never known defeat in African warfare, lay scattered across the battlefield like broken promises of easy Roman destruction. The Roman wounded told their own story of impossible odds overcome through discipline and desperation. Men who had taken multiple arrow wounds continued fighting because retreat meant death and advance offered hope. Centurions reported that soldiers had performed feats of endurance that should have been physically impossible, driven by the knowledge that survival depended entirely on collective action. The extended line formation that had seemed suicidal at midday was now hailed as genius, though Caesar privately admitted that desperation had contributed as much as tactical insight to its success. Without the terrain constraints that funneled Numidian attacks into Roman killing zones, the outcome might have been catastrophically different. Here's what the victory meant strategically beyond the immediate tactical success. Caesar had proven that Roman heavy infantry could defeat superior cavalry numbers in open terrain when properly deployed and led. The psychological impact rippled across North Africa faster than news of the battle itself. Tribal chieftains who had been preparing to join Juba's coalition suddenly reconsidered their allegiances when reports arrived of Numidian elite cavalry, broken by a handful of Roman centuries. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded African mounted warfare since Hannibal's time cracked like sun-baked clay replaced by wed respect for Roman military innovation. The captured equipment revealed the scope of enemy preparation and the magnitude of their defeat. Roman quartermasters cataloged thousands of arrows, javelins, and cavalry lances abandoned in the route. More importantly, they recovered intelligence documents that exposed the full extent of the conspiracy against Caesar. Letters from Cato detailed coordination with Egyptian and Syrian resistance, while Scipio's correspondence revealed planned naval operations designed to cut Caesar's African supply lines. The victory at Ruspina had disrupted more than a single battle. It had shattered a comprehensive strategy designed to destroy Caesar's remaining forces through coordinated pressure from multiple directions. The personal transformation in Caesar himself became visible to every subordinate who had witnessed his leadership during the crisis. The commander, who had seemed almost casual about African dangers, now displayed the focused intensity of someone who understood how close he had come to complete destruction. His orders became more precise, his tactical preparations more thorough, his treatment of local populations more calculated to prevent future coalition building. The near disaster had taught him that African warfare required different approaches than European campaigns, lessons that would prove crucial in subsequent operations against Carthage and Scipio. But perhaps the most significant immediate consequence was the effect on Roman morale throughout Caesar's African army. News of the victory spread through his coastal camps like wildfire, transforming dispirited legions who had been questioning their commanders' judgment into confident troops, ready to face whatever enemies Africa could produce. The soldiers who had survived Ruspina became instant legends, their account of tactical innovation and disciplined courage inspiring entire cohorts that had never seen combat. Veterans who had followed Caesar from Gaul spoke of Ruspina as proof that their commander's legendary fortune extended even to African sand, while newer recruits gained confidence that Roman training could overcome any odds when properly applied. As darkness fell on the battlefield, Caesar stood among the bodies of enemies who had surrounded his 1,000 men 12 hours earlier, and understood that this victory had changed more than tactical doctrine. It had preserved his African campaign, disrupted enemy strategy, and demonstrated once again that audacity, combined with discipline, could achieve mathematical impossibilities that lesser commanders would never attempt. The victory at Ruspina transformed Caesar's African campaign from desperate survival into systematic conquest. Within 6 weeks of the battle, 3 major cities opened their gates to Roman legions rather than face siege by the commander, who had turned impossible odds into tactical doctrine. Thapsus fell after a single day's fighting, when Numidian cavalry refused to charge. Roman formations that might employ the devastating extended line tactics. Utica surrendered without resistance when its defenders learned that Caesar had developed methods for defeating superior cavalry numbers in open terrain. The psychological impact of one afternoon's fighting rippled across North Africa like earthquake tremors, shattering alliances that had taken Cato months to forge. The tactical innovations pioneered at Ruspina became standard Roman doctrine within a generation. Military engineers studied Caesar's use of terrain to channel cavalry attacks into infantry killing zones. Staff officers analyzed how extended formations could neutralize mobility advantages when properly supported by disciplined reserves. Most importantly, Roman commanders learned that tactical flexibility could overcome mathematical disadvantages when desperation was transformed into calculated aggression. The extended line formation appeared in subsequent battles across Africa, Syria, and eventually on the Germanic frontier, proving that innovation born from crisis could become systematic doctrine. But Ruspina's influence extended beyond Roman military thinking. Numidian cavalry tactics, unchanged for centuries, evolved rapidly after their defeat by Caesar's 1,000. Desert warriors who had relied purely on mobility and harassment began incorporating close combat training and coordinated formations designed to counter Roman innovations. The battle forced an entire military culture to adapt face obsolescence, demonstrating that even traditional advantages could be neutralized by tactical creativity under pressure. The personal consequences for key commanders shaped the final phase of Rome's civil wars. Labienus never recovered from the psychological shock of being outgenerated by his former mentor using principles he thought he understood. His subsequent tactical decisions became increasingly conservative, contributing to Republican defeats at Theapsis and ultimately at Munda, where Caesar's veterans proved unstoppable. Cato's suicide at Utica stemmed partly from his realization that Roman military superiority had become unshakable. After Caesar proved that Republican forces couldn't match Caesarian innovation, even when supported by the finest allied troops in the ancient world. The battle's legacy lived in the soldiers who survived it and the stories they told for decades afterward. Veterans of Ruspina formed the backbone of legions that conquered Egypt, fought at Actium, and eventually established the Principate under Augustus. Their first-hand knowledge of tactical innovation under impossible pressure became informal doctrine passed down through centurion ranks. When later Roman armies faced similar challenges, they applied lessons learned on African sand, where 1,000 men had proved that discipline could multiply force more effectively than numbers could overwhelm training. Here's what military historians recognize about Ruspina's broader significance. He demonstrated that tactical innovation could emerge from crisis when commanders possessed both the knowledge to recognize opportunity and the authority to implement radical solutions instantly. Caesar's success required not just personal courage, but systematic understanding of infantry capabilities, cavalry limitations, and terrain advantages that most generals would have missed under pressure. The extended line formation worked because Caesar understood Roman strengths well enough to risk everything on tactical theories that existed nowhere in military manuals. Modern staff colleges still examine Ruspina as the perfect example of defensive action transformed into offensive victory through leadership that refused to accept mathematical inevitability. The principles Caesar applied, using enemy strength against enemy assumptions while maximizing friendly advantages in unexpected contexts, remain relevant wherever inferior forces face superior numbers. The battle proves that tactical genius can emerge from desperate circumstances when preparation meets opportunity in the crucible of combat that tests every assumption about what's possible. The philosophical heart of Ruspina echoes through military history like a constant reminder that human will can overcome mathematical certainty when applied with precise understanding of capabilities and limitations. Caesar's 1,000 men faced 16,000 enemies, not because they were braver or stronger, but because they were better led, better trained, and better able to adapt traditional methods to unprecedented challenges. They proved that impossible odds become possible when tactical innovation meets disciplined execution in circumstances that demand both. On January 4th, 46 billions CE, Julius Caesar watched 1,000 Roman soldiers prove that mathematical impossibility yields to tactical genius when desperation is transformed into calculated audacity, and in doing so demonstrated that the greatest victories emerge not from superior numbers, but from superior thinking, applied under pressure that would break ordinary men.